Hi, everybody, and a very, very warm welcome to all of you who are joining us today for the first round of conversations, of transatlantic conversations among historians on democracy. There are about 300 of you and of us who meet here via the internet, and we also kind of streamed, and so that others can see us on YouTube who've missed this first and very innovative event. The format is such that we start with our panelists. There are 5 of them, coming from both the United States and Germany mostly, coming from being of different gender, and also, which is also very important, of different generations. We could also actually call it a trans-Pacific conversation tonight, since I'm joining you from a hotel room in Tokyo, and it's midnight actually now. So forgive me for any lapses that might occur. Now, maybe I should first introduce myself before I introduce everybody else. My name is Ute Frevert. I'm a historian, a German historian who is taught in both German and American universities, and who now serves as the president of the Max Weber Foundation, which co-hosts this series of conversations. The Max Weber Foundations is a kind of global network of historical institutes that are spread, again, all over the world. We have institutes in 10 host societies, some of which are what we might call difficult in terms of democratic procedures. And so we had an institute until last year in Moscow. We had an office in Beijing, which we closed by now. We still have one and are not considering closing in Turkey, in India, and also in Lebanon. All these are countries where democracy and what we understand maybe under the term democracy are at least under threat. And recently, another host country of ours has joined this group of difficult democracies or illiberal democracies or not democracies at all, the US. And that has come to most of us probably as a great shock. And in the wake of that shock, we started drawing analogies, we started comparing. Many of us kind of thought or felt reminded of the Weimar years, of the late years of the Weimar Republic and the rise of fascism. Others felt similar or see similarities with what they watched or experienced in former countries of the Eastern Bloc. And all these comparisons, all these analogies are a good reason, I think, to start this conversation on democracy, a conversation that is led by our professional expertise. And the idea to start this and also to continue, hopefully, this series of conversations is not mine. It comes from Christina Morina, who kind of had a great, she had a great idea, but she also took the initiative to get all of us on board. And that's already a great achievement. And so it's only fair to give Christina the floor for the first intervention. All these interventions that come from our 5 panelists, and I'll introduce them one by one, should be between 4 and 5 minutes, so that we will have about 25 to 28 minutes on the panel, and then we'll open the discussion to all our participants. So Christina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ute Frevert, so much for this introduction, also for jumping on the idea immediately and engaging with it and helping us set this up. So let me start with my few words. I grew up in a dictatorship. I was 13 years old when the East German regime crumbled. I know what it feels like to be afraid of the government. After witnessing the fall of the wall in 1989, I thought I would never have to be afraid again to say what I think. What I find most disturbing about this moment in the US is not the authoritarian policies implemented by the second Trump administration. We all could have seen that coming. What I find most disturbing is the extent of people's fear and how rapidly it spreads in this country. Students and colleagues telling me they are concerned about their safety, about visas being revoked or even being arrested. Intellectuals pondering not the content of their speech, but the risks it might entail, weighing consequences as people do in the autocracies we know from history or other places in the world. That is something I never could have imagined and that I find impossible to accept. So we have many things to fear today, not least fear itself. As a historian, I can handle this fear by thinking critically about analogies, comparisons, and contingencies. Critical historical thinking doesn't offer generalizations or simple lessons, but quite the opposite, the ability to differentiate. History forces us to be precise. That means to realize that there's no such thing as a global history of democracy. Rather, there are many local stories of democracy with specific, often nationally framed paths and traits. Democratic states are interconnected. They can reinforce or undermine each other. But each democracy is tied to a unique physical and cultural territory. So I look at this moment not through the prism of 1933, but of 1776. Next year, the American Republic will be 250 years in the making. Its ideals of equality, liberty, and self-government based on reason and choice have yet to be fully realized. But this republic, however flawed, is built on a centuries-long tradition of democratic institutions, a commitment to the rule of law, and on a lived concept of citizenship based not on blood or pure self-interest, but on the idea that the pursuit of happiness is fundamentally a human right. This centuries-old tradition of democracy stands in stark contrast to the short-lived Weimar Republic, the most common historical analogy used these days. This contrast should never be forgotten when thinking about the roots and realities of this moment, or when weighing the appropriate responses to it. But there are parallels. Democracy in the US is being challenged by a political movement that shares some of the features of the fascisms of the past. An unquestioned leader claiming a total mandate and ready to exploit the lowest instincts of men. A deep resentment at pluralism, compromise, and critique, and a ruthless determination to intimidate perceived enemies as well as the weakest in society. Crucially, the political violence of the 21st century is not being brewed up in beer halls, but in online forums reaching millions of followers and funded by billions of partisan dollars. Let me conclude. We can best grasp these present circumstances if we don't treat history as a playbook. It is a source of knowledge, an invitation to reflect, and a force to make out the differences. One conclusion might be that given its long Republican tradition, hardly any other country in the world is as well positioned to save its democracy than the United States. Publicly debating such questions, as we want to do with this series, is one way to help stop the spread of fear. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Christina, for these very kind of optimistic statements. I have to apologize. I completely forgot, because I'm such a fan of yours, to introduce you actually, not just as the initiator of this series, but in your professional status. Christina is a professor of contemporary history at the University of Bielefeld, and just now she's serving as the Theodor Heuss professor at the New School. This said, I pass on the baton to James Grossman, who is the executive director of the American Historical Association. Thanks for being with us, James.
Thank you for the invitation. And I very much want to address the issue that Christina has mentioned about fear. And I'll get to that towards the end. But I want to start with the official assignment. I'm trying to be better at following the rules. If there's anybody here in the audience who knows me well, they know that I'm not very good at it. So this is my attempt. We were asked to address what was, what is, and what can be done. Of course, all in 4 minutes. So in the United States, democracy is often rhetorically framed in terms of the opening words of the Constitution and the closing words of Abraham Lincoln's address at Gettysburg during the Civil War. The Constitution begins, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity." This is a reasonable list of some, even if not all, aspects of democracy, but enough to establish some goals and some principles against which we can measure public policy, whether yesterday, today, or tomorrow. Lincoln, amidst the Civil War, not only affirmed these principles, but also reminds us actually, that only a certain kind of government can maintain and implement these principles. He notes that we have veered away from them, and he prays for redemption. "These dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." Now, I'm not saying that the preamble to the Constitution, a document written only by men, and many of whom owned, bought, and sold other humans, reflect a what was that we should seek to recover. But it does articulate a set of democratic principles that embody what some people could and should be thinking about, again, with all of their imperfections and the document's imperfections. And as a historian, I'm very careful about making generalizations about what is, especially in a time of turmoil, which was the context of Lincoln's famous speech and, as Christina has indicated, our context today. But Lincoln does, perhaps, help us understand what should be done, whether it is a matter of restoration, as some more conservative Americans would argue, or a matter of vision, a notion of what can be done. Now, this was our assignment, but I want to add, because I'm never good at completely following the rules, I want to add one more element: the obstacles to maintaining the democratic institutions that we cherish and to building new ones. There are many, but I want to identify two, which we can discuss if my colleagues want to do so, and one of them Christina has already put out there, and that is fear. And the power of fear, the utility of fear in a political context. Fear, most people who study politics agree that fear is a lot more powerful than love or desire. Roosevelt's famous "we have nothing to fear but fear itself" was in some ways banal, because that's ridiculous. In 1933, we had a hell of a lot to fear, and it wasn't just fear itself. And we would have had more to fear if more Americans had understood what was happening in Germany at the time. So we have to realize that, yes, fear itself is something that's a problem, because fear itself is something that demagogues can mobilize, again, in ways that Christina has talked about. So that's one thing. The second is the hostility towards, or even mere skepticism of, institutions. And Ute also mentioned expertise, which is related to institutions. And I think that if we're going to talk about what the obstacles are to thinking about and implementing democratic principles, institutions, procedures, we have to think about the extent to which the United States, at least, and I would be interested in hearing about Germany, I believe it's similar, the extent to which in the United States, the left-right dichotomy, political spectrum, has perhaps been overshadowed, or at least is in competition with, a dichotomy that has to do with faith in institutions and skepticism of and downright hostility to institutions. In 2024, there were polls that showed that many voters favored Trump and Sanders. That issue of institutions helps us to understand that, and it helps us to understand perhaps why many people either didn't vote or voted, quite frankly, against their interest. So these are the two things that I would put on the table, fear and institutions. And then one might add, Christina mentioned pluralism, which I think is another category to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you, James, very, very much. I think there is something in the making already in this conversation series, a panel on exactly the topic of institutions, and we might also include a panel on emotions. Just kidding. Now, next speaker is Dagmar Herzog. Dagmar Herzog is a professor of many things, but history of religion, history of sexualities, and other things, and she teaches at the CUNY Graduate Center in New York. Dagmar, great to have you here. We don't hear you.
Thank you so much for having me. And in fact, it is my task to say something about the emotional climate in the US. Above all, there is no agreement now on reality. There have certainly been moments of hope recently, Senator Cory Booker's 25-hour speech, the demonstrations on Saturday, or even the formerly pro-Trump podcaster Joe Rogan criticizing the sweeping up of a non-criminal gay hairdresser into that terrifying El Salvador prison. But the Supreme Court decision on Monday shows what brutal violation of the rule of law is now condoned at the highest levels. And right-wing media, could show you headlines, including like the New York Post, is still every day insisting in loud screaming headlines that Democrats are the violent ones, and even that Trump's catastrophic economic gambits might still work. And many citizens who are not immediately affected are not fearful as yet. It's this complete inversion of reality that characterizes the emotional climate. 43% of the nation still approves of the president, and significant portions of the privileged elite are still making excuses, even though we're living through 3 major assaults on basic existential security, livelihoods, freedom of speech, on knowledge, and on empathy itself. And I do want to quote Theodor Adorno from the essay Education After Auschwitz from 1966, because this has to do with the assault on empathy. So the quote is, "The inability to identify with others was unquestionably the most important psychological condition for the fact that something like Auschwitz could have occurred in the midst of more or less civilized and innocent people. The precious human capacity to identify cross boundaries has been dismissed as woke, as reverse racism, as benefiting the stupid and lazy who haven't earned it. This has been going on for a while. It's obviously a total inversion of Judeo-Christian ethics. It's also a violation of the secular fundamentals of equal human rights. but we have been living through already for years now a deliberate disorientation of morality. It is really an attempt to reshape human nature, not so much to instill a specific set of ideas, as rather to indoctrinate into a feeling of in-group superiority towards vulnerable others. So what's different from the fascisms of the past is that this one is a huge kleptocracy, a repressive one. And to facilitate that theft and to confuse people about it, there has been an aggressive push to re-hierarchize human value and make a frontal assault on the democratic ideals of the dignity and equal worth of every human being, and to do so by, first of all, going after the already stigmatized, the foreigner, the transgender, the disabled. There are evangelical Christians now on a campaign to insist that empathy is dangerous, that it's toxic. Elon Musk says that empathy destroys civilization. So historians, why study the past? To argue about the appropriateness or not of analogies with the 30s to somehow wake people up? I would say no, or not only. I would say we turn to the past, yes, to the 1930s, 40s in Germany, but also, for example, to Chile and Brazil and Argentina in the 60s and 70s, to remember that there are many, many different ways we now need to learn to be brave. I want to remind us that when we study history, it's to remember that anti-fascism or non-fascism requires both protest and protection of the vulnerable. Max Weber distinguished between Gesinnungsethik, ethics of conviction, versus Verantwortungsethik, the ethics of responsibility. But the latter is a supplement to the former, not its opposite. We now, looking back on the Nazis, honor people who protested and those who protected Jews or political opponents, who created fake passports, alternative sources of income, hid people, helped escapes. And with regard to the disabled, we honor those who changed diagnoses, who sent vulnerable people home to their families so they wouldn't be murdered, or again, hid them away until the danger is over. These are dark times, but half the country, including substantial members of the elite, does not acknowledge that as yet. Nobody knows how to behave when fascism comes. It takes time to figure out where to give money, where to give shelter, where to give courage and care. But there are lots of ways to be honorable, and history can be a great resource for us in this way.
Thank you, Dagmar. And this sentence of yours, we have to learn how to be brave. Let's keep that in mind. And move on now very swiftly to Colin Berg, our youngest panelist today. Colin, you are an MA student at the New School. So welcome to this group of elderly people.
Yes, I'm honored to be speaking among all of this panel, very accomplished historians who have done a lot more than me. And Professor Morina has done a great job of organizing and asked me to speak. And I told her, like, you know, what can I add? And she said, well, we want a young voice, so I'm going to talk about my demographic and relating this moment to the young people, and particularly young men. And so so I've been studying, you know, the collapse of the Weimar Republic and the ongoing breakdown currently of the American Republic. And one of the core parallels is that they show us that fascism often rises by appealing to young men experiencing a crisis of identity, meaning, and belonging. Authoritarian movements don't succeed through policy alone. They succeed often by giving this disoriented young men a sense of purpose, of community, of value, in a world where things have been lost. So the what was of my talk, I want to talk about, you know, young men in the post-World War I era in Germany. Millions of German young men came home from World War I, disillusioned, humiliated, and feeling directionlessness. Many felt alienated from the new Weimar liberal order and longed for hierarchy and a shared identity that they had experienced. The Nazis exploited this very effectively. First, through the SA, they offered a new community and structure, belonging, and discipline. So that was a big draw for a lot of young men. They also went out into universities and built extensive youth organizations, student clubs, even sports groups. that did a great job of and effectively, give young men a sense of collective identity. And they're also very effective with their symbolism. The Sig Heil salute, the swastika, the symbolic meaning of this all sort of made people feel like they belong in this group by doing a shared act together on a mass level. Now, right now, if we look at Trump's election, about, the AP, looking at the APs, about 6 in 10 young men under 30 voted for Trump. And this was a huge swing. You could argue was one of the key reasons why Trump won. And today's young men, it's much different, the situation, but they also experience a disorienting reality, a collapse of community, economic insecurity, and a digital culture that breeds isolation. And YouTube podcasts. I was talking to Professor Morina's son, and we both watched some of the same young men podcasts. And they've become a huge home for young minds. We look at like this complex of a far right of like a far right sort of bridge of these podcasters that kind of can lead to the beginning of radicalization for people. So that includes like Joe Rogan, Theo Vaughn, Andrew Schultz, Lex Friedman, and then like Tucker Carlson's like particularly far right. And they all understand these very well. These platforms offer an emotional ecosystem, it affirms identity, and it provides an imagined sort of community among everyone participating. And you see a lot of this if you look down at the YouTube comments. And this is really where like dialogue and people feel like they belong. And civically, these podcasts, their use of imagery really creates like a feeling of direct communication. Go look at Tucker Carlson's background. He's in it. It's very inviting. Like, as much as I don't like the guy, I'm like, I kind of want to be in his home. It's a beautiful wooden aesthetic in the back. It's like, I want to sit down and talk with Tucker Carlson. If I look at that, Rogan kind of has the college dorm aesthetic with the American flag in the back. And so the symbolic meaning of these podcasts, create this feeling of a direct personal relationship with the people that come on the podcast. And so when Trump comes on these podcasts, the symbolic meaning a lot of young men feel is that he is directly talking to me. And when that is compounded by the whole community being involved with that, it's like Trump is one of the boys, right? And that's the symbolic meaning that he exploited really well. He went on Andrew Schultz, he went on Lex Friedman, he went on Rogan, he went on Theo Vaughn. All Kamala really went on was the Shannon Sharp podcast, and even that was scripted, so it sort of felt like she's not one of us and doesn't really like us, and that I think was a huge feeling. And so this was a missed opportunity, I think. Dismissing these platforms or often these platforms, right, are dismissed as unserious, and that often, pushes young people further towards those who listen and manipulate young men want, last thing is that these podcasts, this is, we often think, oh, young men, they just want to, lift weights, swipe on Tinder, fire off a few tweets. But these are 3-hour conversations. So this is a big opportunity because it also reveals that there is a longing for a deeper meaning. And there is a bigger attention span if you get their attention to something that they're curious about. And so to end of the what can be done, I think there's an opportunity, and I think that we can get the ear of a lot of these young men that are listening to these podcasts. And I think historians should really become involved in these online spaces and just more public and communicating history as something that will give that community a meaning, because a lot of people are looking for it. And if we don't do that, then the fascists are going to exploit that vacancy.
Thank you very much, Colin. I felt reminded of Roosevelt's fireside chats as an alternative to historical alternative to what you were just describing. I'm not sure that historians are really kind of the right people to give that kind of feeling that you described so well to the young men and to the young people, but we'll see. Our last speaker is Jürgen Kocker. He joins us from Berlin tonight or today. He is a venerable social historian, and his last professional position was as director of the WZB, the science, what is it? Social Science Center in Berlin. Jürgen, it's your turn.
Thank you. I want to present a few ideas about how one, as a historian, mainly a historian of Germany and Europe, might be useful for understanding and dealing with the present situation. 3 points, if I make it in 5 minutes. Presently, the comparison between Germany in the 1920s and 30s and the US now are frequent with respect to the crisis of liberal democracy, the rise of right-wing extremism, though in different forms, with respect to resilience and surrender. We discuss observable and likely differences, as well as observable and threatening similarities. I am particularly impressed by the weakness of resistance then and now, the quick adjustment of so many institutions, groups, and individuals reorienting themselves in the new power situation after the takeover of the Nazis in early 1933 and after the recent coming to power of Trump and his team. Hopefully, this similarity will be transitory and be turned into a major difference when resistance against Trump will become stronger in the next months, but one doesn't know. Another example of useful comparison can be found in the work of economic historians who analyze the detrimental role of protectionist tariffs in the 1930s, especially in the US, which tariffs which did not initiate but aggravate the crisis, turning it into a worldwide economic crisis. These are comparisons which do not lead to predictions, but they serve as warnings about what may come out of presently visible developments in the US, but need not, if taken serious. My second point on contextualization. Just one example. Most observers and experts outside and inside the United States regard Trump's passion for and application of tariffs, custom tariffs, as self-defeating for the Americans and destructive for the world economy. But Trump's strange passion for protective custom tariffs becomes less incomprehensible once we take into account the function of this tariff policy for the centralization of political power and the conversion of the political system into a more authoritarian, if not dictatorial, system as apparently aspired to by Trump and his group. The system of tariffs intended by Trump will tremendously enhance the president's power in that he can grant or refuse exemptions to single branches, specific regions, or single corporations in exchange for their political support, quite in contrast to the market, if it is left over to the market to decide about success and failure in economic terms. So, what I want to say, contextualization helps to improve our understanding of the emerging economic political system. What appears to be foolish in strictly economic terms can be understood as functional and purposeful politically. Historians are trained in not isolating single dimensions of social reality, but in bringing them together and contextualizing them. Third and last point, causation. I would love to speak about the role of American capitalism for the rise of Trumpism and the move of tech billionaires from Silicon Valley liberalism to the embarrassing submission under Trump, but I must leave this aside. I must restrict myself now to saying that the rise of Trumpism is just a part, though a very dramatic, influential, and perhaps decisive part of a broader bundle of global trends, which need to be analyzed in universal historical categories. Something happened in the second decade of this century that ended or decisively weakened previous decades-long trends towards more liberal, more democratic, more cosmopolitan processes based on rules and negotiations, enlightened worldviews. Opposite trends became stronger and increasingly dominant, which have led to more fragmentation, nationalism, populism on the right and on the left, culture wars, declining strength of liberal democratic principles, deglobalization. American power had played a major role in bringing those more liberal, more progressive world into being over decades since World War II, and perhaps as a way of learning from the catastrophes of the first part of the 20th century. And this made America great again, I must say, over the decades in the second half of the 20th century. Nowadays, America plays a tremendously important role in reversing this, and all this is much too complicated now to analyze. But I want to say that we need a broader approach and a more universal historical approach to the study of what happens now in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Jürgen, for reminding us of our professional duties, but also for kind of warning us that there might be some ugly similarities or even analogies between the end of Weimar and today in terms of the weakness, what you started your talk with, the weakness of resistance. And actually that's also the question of what has been asked in the title of this first round of conversations. What can be done and what can we do as professional historians? Analyze, yes, and also kind of draw parallels and also see that this is not just an American phenomenon, but that we see in many countries, but also kind of not whip up resistance, but show how what ways of resistance there actually are. Now, this said, there is the possibility of the audience, which consists now of, I think, 150 people, to also kind of make their voices heard. unfortunately, I don't see anybody, kind of who is in the audience. So I actually don't know if you're raising your digital hand or not. I don't know if our administrators can help here, but those of you who would like to say something, they should first start doing that by raising their digital hand. So is there anybody who would like to add? Jeffrey Herf. And maybe you can introduce yourself very, very briefly.
Yes, I'm Jeffrey Herf. I think many of you know who I am. I'm a free man because I'm an emeritus professor, and so I can now say what I want, as I have for many years anyway. It's wonderful to see so many of the colleagues in Germany and here. Thank you to the panel. I think I've written about the comparisons and the similarities and differences between 1930-33 and what we're seeing now. And I drew attention to the role of differences between the Bundesrepublik and the United States, and between a parliamentary system and a presidential system. I see Jim Ritalik is on this call too, so I was thinking of his work. Once Donald Trump captured the Republican Party, he was in a position of remarkable power, whereas in Germany, because of the parliamentary system, the CDU and CSU has resisted so far an alliance with the AfD. That's a profound difference in our political system. I also would draw attention to the issue that all of the panelists raised about fear and lack of resistance, because there's one group of people in the political system that doesn't have anything to fear and has 6-year terms and cannot be fired by Donald Trump, and that's the United States Senate. Maybe Jim Grossman will want to talk about that, because the Senate is the institution with the Republican senators in the United States Senate could easily have prevented all of this. Perhaps not easily, but they could have prevented it if they had banded together and opposed Trump's lawlessness and then the insanity of the tariffs. So I think that what we as historians can do is quite limited. We can write books and essays, and we can remind people of what actually happened in the past. But the sober reality is that at least 77 million of our fellow citizens don't give a damn what we think. And so this is a crisis for the profession of history as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Jim, you wanted to come in on the role of the Senate?
Yeah, just quickly to respond to Jeffrey on the role of the Senate. What I have been told, and I think the sources are pretty good, is that there are a few members of Congress who actually are physically afraid for their families. And I don't want to overemphasize that. This is not the world of the brown shirts, but this is apparently not, it's not non-existent as a fear among some legislators. Much more important, quite frankly, is the appeal of office holding, which sounds horrible, but that is much of what is going on. One of the differences that has taken place in the American electoral system is that, say, 20, 30 years ago, Republican members of the Senate would have been worried about losing a general election. And they therefore would have calculated their strategies based on their sense of the full electorate. Now their fear is much more of a primary. And so if they are committed to holding their office in the face of what we're talking about, then what they're worried about is looking to their right to a primary. And as I was walking yesterday through the House office buildings, and the Senate would be even more the case, it's good to be a member of Congress. It's a good life. And I say that, I hate to say that, but that is part of what is going on, is a sense of people wanting to hold on to their office. I don't think there was ever any chance that the Republicans in the United States Senate were going to stand up to Donald Trump when he first walked in. It could well be that this will happen. And what I'm waiting for is July and August, when farmers in the upper Midwest are not able to sell their crops internationally. But in March and April, there are no crops yet. So I think these are the sorts of things that might make a difference in the Congress.
Thank you, Jim. Jeremy Varon?
Hi. First off, I'm extremely grateful for this forum and then heartened to see so many people on it. I just want to say that I appreciate how much the panelists emphasized, fear, which is an elusive, non-material, but important dimension of life. And, people are terrified on campuses, especially foreign students and foreign faculty. And the New School has, I think, the most international student body in the country, extremely vulnerable, because if foreign students don't study here, we lose their tuition dollars and the place could be bankrupted. I think that's part of the strategy to make America so unwelcoming, so unpleasant, so precarious for any foreign visitor, even a Canadian wanting to come on vacation, that people just stay away. And then that's part of the existential threat to the academy. So the fear is real and it varies based on subjectivity. But I think pushing back on the fear is an important part of resistance. In the famous civil rights anthem, "We Shall Overcome," one of the most important lines was, "We are not afraid." And of course, people were afraid of the Klan, racist police, being beaten, fire hosed, whatever. But it galvanized people to say, we are afraid, but in spite of the fear, we must act because everything depends on it. And then, to put a little plug, we're trying to have a national day of action to defend higher education on April 17th and have people out in the streets. And, we're afraid to represent our own cause. But somebody has to stand up to the silencing effect of fear itself. And then, break the spell of self-censorship that has already, I think, befallen academic, communities. And then, they will take notice if there's people exercising that small courage, to say, Mr. Trump, you're ultimately in the minority. Only 42% of people approve of you. When, Minnesota farmers go broke, it'll be even, smaller. So there is some value of boldness in the face of terror. And then those of us who are native citizens and who might be white probably have a special obligation to be public in ways that our colleagues and friends might not be so easily able to. And then I even think a conversation like this is an act of resistance, not to puff it up, but it's significant. And I'm so impressed that Christina, on a visa, had the wherewithal to organize this. And I hope it keeps going. Thank you.
At least the University of Bielefeld will welcome her back if she loses the visa. No, but thanks, Jeremy, for again stressing the role of fear, and a fear that is very personal, but that can only be overcome. And that's also a lesson from German history. If it gets organized, if each person for him or herself, or by him or herself, is probably absolutely consumed by the fear. But once you get the idea that there are many of you, that there is an organization, that there is the Association of American Historians, you name it, some collective that stands up, it makes it far, far easier. But now it's Jonathan Wiesen.
Yes, thanks everyone. This is really a fantastic panel. I'm coming to you from the University of Alabama at Birmingham, where I teach history. And one thing I noticed is that at the gatherings and rallies on last weekend, it was almost entirely white. And we had a huge problem building coalitions across racial barriers. One of the things I heard from my African-American students is that there are a couple things going on. Were told to not come by some people in their community because, of course, they had a greater fear of police brutality and other things that they're much more used to than we as academics. But the second thing, too, is one that I think we've all heard, too, and that's sort of like a sort of modest chuckle of despair that we're learning a little bit now about the fear that they have felt for a while. So I think one of the challenges for us and the answers to the question of what we do next is to keep building along these coalitions locally. It's been very hard, though, as we noticed on the weekend. I don't know if others of you have found that, but certainly in a predominantly African-American city like Birmingham, we had almost no people of color. And so that is a level of, I think if we speak about these fears across communities, that in and of itself will be useful. The other thing I'm noticing amongst my students and my colleagues, frankly, is the question, what do we do now and what forms does resistance take? And here I think we're struggling to figure out whether our own teaching in the classroom is a form of resistance, the sort of resistance that we've all studied. Does it count? Does the fact that we kind of hide behind our own scholarly apparatuses and really say and teach important things, does that count? And I think for me, at least, as sort of the personal confession is that there isn't a day that I don't wake up where I wonder, like, am I doing enough? And what forms does resistance have to take in opposition? So I think these are the nature of the dialogues I'm having, and I'm sure some of you are having. So, but my first point is obviously a cliche one, is to, act locally, which is seems particularly fruitless in the South sometimes, but nonetheless is empowering. Thanks so much for everything.
Thanks so much, Jonathan, for also drawing our attention to the role of alliances and coalitions. We can't do it all by ourselves. Absolutely. Matthew Stibbe, next.
Thank you. I'm coming from the UK. I'm very pleased to have been invited to this wonderful panel. I'm going to ask a couple of questions to panelists, and I'm really bouncing off some of their ideas. But just to give a couple of UK perspectives on this, reacting to something that Jürgen Kocher said in The Guardian today, the left liberal newspaper in Britain, there's a picture with understandable schadenfreude explaining how many billions of dollars some of the top billionaires like Elon Musk have lost since the tariffs have been introduced. But I can see from what Jürgen Kocher was saying, it's very important that we understand that it's beyond it's not the point. The money isn't the point that they've lost. It's about the concentration of power. And therefore, I think historians in that sense have got a very important role to play in explaining that to people who've been brought up in a world where we think that everything's motivated by free market economics, and it obviously isn't. We have come to the end of an era of free market economics where everything is about dollars and how much you can accumulate, and it's now about the accumulation of power again, as it was in the 30s. So I was quite interested in that. And then I want to ask Colin Berg. I was very fascinated by what you said. In the UK recently, and perhaps around the rest of the world, there's been a Netflix film called Adolescence, a UK production, about toxic masculinity, about a very sad story about a young teenage boy who kills a girl at his school after being indoctrinated effectively by toxic masculinity through social media. I noticed that there is an article about it in Die Zeit in the Hamburg newspaper this week. So it is making waves across borders. I was just interested perhaps to hear from Colin Berg about whether it is known yet in the US. In the UK, and talking about empathy, it has both raised a lot of empathy with young people and raised awareness and a lot of discussions about toxic masculinity. But I also see some right-wing voices pushing back and being worried that this might raise empathy. I think there is the Netflix film has usefully exposed a weak point in far-right discourse, that masculinity is in the way that's been promoted by the far right is toxic, and when it's exposed in the way that this drama exposed it does raise a lot of empathy, a lot of questions that can be useful for fighting back for democracy and human dignity. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. But the series also points towards the responsibility of adults, especially the father. And that brings me back to Jonathan's point, is teaching enough? Teaching is, I think, enormously important because young people look for help or guidance or advice in this situation that for most of them is very new, very recent, although it's been prepared for some time, but still teaching is a form of resistance, if you ask me. I don't see any other hands raised. So if there are none, we have, oh no, we have 5 minutes. There is one, Scott Denham, and probably you're the last one to speak.
Yeah, hi, I just want to say thanks for this. I'm putting this in the chat right now, but one sort of act of resistance I'm doing at a small liberal arts college, Davidson College, which is full of wealth and privilege. And I'm in a position to send readings to my students every week of what I'm reading, email with the students in the BCC line, so nobody knows who's getting it, with sort of standard Substack analysis, Krugman and Snyder and Adam Tooze. And then also I'm careful always to offer some conservative positions, and then things that they wouldn't really find on Substack. So that has been really successful. I do it about once a week, and students are appreciative, and it feels like they're being cared for in some way. And it gets them off of their phones a little bit. So that's a tiny teaching tool that, you know, from my position of safety as a senior member of an institution, can do with really no risk. And it's also institutionally bound. It's not on social media, so it feels like a kind of a safe space. So that's been really useful.
Thank you very much. And I think it's a good way to remind us all that it doesn't really help to point out that there are mightier institutions than us historians, starting with big law firms who, or the presidents of private universities with huge endowments that also kind of show very little resistance to what's been asked by them. It basically comes down to all of us, because we all also have something to lose. There's nobody who's completely, as Jeremy said, free. But still, there is also something to gain. Now, I think we basically at the end of our session here, and let me finish by thanking all of you, the panelists, but also the people who intervened from the audience, for your interest in the topic. The conversation will go on. Christina already kind of posted it. The next conversation on transatlantic conversation of historians who talk about democracy will be on April this 22nd. And the panelists are already there waiting. Some of them have been here in our audience, like Jeremy Warren. There will be Marion Kaplan speaking, and Till van Raden from the University of Montreal, and some others probably who will join us. So please join in again on April 22nd, and there will be more to come. And also, if you wish, just write suggestions about topics, about speakers, to ask to Christina, but also to the Max Weber Foundation. We'll all collect them and try to put them in place. This said, I'm going to bed now, but you have a whole day to enjoy. So thanks very much, and thanks again to Christina for initiating this series. Good night and good luck.
Thank you, Ute. Thank you all for coming, and talk to you all soon, hopefully. We will keep the Zoom open to be able to save the chat, I think, at the very end. So as people are leaving, I will stick around a little bit together with the team.